The text message came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Isabel Martinez stared at her phone screen, reading her sister's words for the third time. Family meeting tomorrow at Mom's. 2 p.m. We need to discuss your situation. Your situation. As if her life had become a problem that needed solving by committee. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Isabel set her phone face down on her nightstand and pulled the covers over her head. She knew exactly what this meeting was about. For months, her family had been dropping hints, making concerned phone calls, showing up unannounced with casseroles and worried expressions. They thought she was falling apart. What they didn't know was that Isabel had been preparing for this moment. While they whispered about her mental state behind closed doors, she had been documenting everything. Every boundary they crossed, every manipulation, every attempt to control her life under the guise of caring. Tomorrow's family meeting would be interesting, but not in the way they expected. Isabel woke up that Wednesday morning with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. The anxiety that usually gripped her stomach the moment consciousness returned was replaced by something else entirely. A cold, calculated calm. She made her coffee stronger than usual, scrambled 2 eggs instead of her typical yogurt, and selected her clothes with the precision of someone preparing for battle. The navy blazer her ex-husband had bought her for job interviews 3 years ago. The pearl earrings her grandmother had left her. The black slacks that made her feel professional and untouchable. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone who looked ready for a boardroom, not a family intervention. Her phone buzzed with another text from her sister Rebecca. Mom's making your favorite cookies. We just want to help, Izzy. Isabel deleted the message without responding. She had stopped being Izzy the day she moved out of her mother's house 18 years ago, but her family refused to acknowledge that detail along with most others about who she actually was versus who they needed her to be. The drive to her childhood home in Millbrook Heights took exactly 23 minutes. Isabel had timed it deliberately, arriving at 2:03 p.m., late enough to make a point, early enough to avoid accusations of disrespect. She parked across the street, noting that both Rebecca's silver SUV and her brother Marcus's black pickup were already in the driveway. Her mother's beige sedan sat in its usual spot, the one their father had always parked in before the heart attack took him 5 years ago. The house looked exactly the same as it had when Isabel was 16 and desperate to escape. Same white shutters that needed repainting. Same overgrown rose bushes that her mother refused to trim properly. Same front porch where family discussions became family tribunals, where individual voices got lost in the collective need to maintain appearances. Isabel walked up the familiar brick pathway, her heels clicking with authority she had learned to project during her years in marketing before the layoffs, before the divorce, before the series of events that had led her family to believe she was having some sort of breakdown instead of a breakthrough. The front door opened before she could knock. Her mother, Dorothy Martinez, stood there with the same expression she'd worn when Isabel had come home past curfew 20 years ago, disappointed but trying to hide it behind maternal concern. Isabel, honey, come in. We're all here. The living room had been arranged like a therapy session. 4 chairs positioned in a semicircle, with 1 chair facing the others. Isabel's chair, obviously. Rebecca sat on the left, her blonde hair pulled back in the same ponytail she'd worn since high school, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. Marcus occupied the chair on the right, his thick arms crossed over his chest, jaw already set in the stubborn line that meant he had decided how this conversation would go before it started. Dorothy took the middle chair, the position of authority she had held in every family discussion since their father's death. The empty chair facing them might as well have had defendant written on it. "Sit down, sweetheart," Dorothy said, gesturing to the isolated chair. "We need to talk." Isabel remained standing. "I can hear just fine from here." The first crack in D. Their planned intervention, She watched Rebecca and Marcus exchange glances, saw her mother's mouth tighten almost imperceptibly. They had expected compliance, automatic deference to family hierarchy. "This is serious, Isabel," Marcus said, leaning forward. "We're worried about you." "Define worried," Isabel replied, her voice steady. Rebecca jumped in, her tone gentle but patronizing. "You've been isolating yourself. You barely answer your phone. When was the last time you came to family dinner? Mom says you haven't been to church in months." "Since the divorce," Dorothy added quietly, as if Isabel's absence from church explained everything wrong with her current life choices. Isabel let the silence stretch for several seconds, watching their discomfort grow. Finally, she spoke. "Is this where I'm supposed to break down and admit I've lost my way? Where I thank you all for staging this intervention and promise to return to being the version of myself that makes you comfortable?" "That's not," Rebecca started. "Because that's not happening," Isabel continued. "I'm 34 years old. I've been supporting myself since I was 18. I own my apartment. I have savings. I pay my bills on time, and I haven't asked any of you for anything in over 2 years. So I'm curious about what exactly constitutes this crisis you've diagnosed." Marcus's face reddened slightly. "You've become someone we don't recognize." "Good," Isabel said simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Dorothy's hands fluttered to her pearl necklace, the gesture she always made when conversations veered away from her script. "Isabel, honey, we love you," her mother said. "But you're not acting like yourself. The divorce was hard, we understand that. Losing your job was devastating. But shutting us out isn't the answer." "I haven't shut you out," Isabel replied. "I've established boundaries. There's a difference." "Boundaries?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call refusing to discuss your therapy sessions? Not telling us about your dating life? Moving to that apartment without asking anyone's opinion?" Isabel felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. "My therapy sessions are confidential. My dating life is private, and I didn't realize I needed permission to choose where I live." "You know that's not what he meant," Rebecca said quickly, shooting Marcus a warning look. We miss being part of your life. You used to tell us everything." "I used to tell you what you wanted to hear," Isabel corrected. "I used to make decisions based on what would cause the least amount of family drama instead of what was best for me. I used to prioritize keeping all of you comfortable over my own well-being." Dorothy's voice sharpened. "That's what family does, Isabel. We consider each other's feelings. We make sacrifices. We don't just think about ourselves." The words hit exactly where they were intended to. The guilt center that had been carefully cultivated over 3 decades of family dynamics. But instead of the usual shame spiral, Isabel felt something else entirely. Clarity. "You're right, Mom. Families should consider each other's feelings. So let me ask you something." Isabel's voice remained level, professional. "When you call me every day asking if I'm okay and refuse to accept my answer, are you considering my feelings? When you show up at my apartment unannounced because you were worried, are you considering my feelings? When you discuss my personal business with Rebecca and Marcus behind my back, are you considering my feelings?" "We don't," Dorothy began. "3 weeks ago, you called my former mother-in-law to ask if she thought I was having a nervous breakdown," Isabel continued. "Margaret Phillips called to give me a heads up because she was concerned about your behavior, not mine." The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause. This one carried the weight of exposure, of secrets dragged into daylight. Rebecca's face had gone pale. "Mom, you didn't." "I was worried," Dorothy said defensively. "Isabel won't talk to any of us about what's really going on. I thought maybe Margaret might have insight." "Into what?" Isabel asked. "Why did I left a marriage that made me miserable? Into why I quit attending family dinners where every conversation became an analysis of my life choices? Why did I stop Going to a church where the pastor's wife asks intrusive questions about my personal life and reports back to you? Marcus stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. We're your family, Isabel. We have a right to be concerned. You have a right to your feelings, Isabel replied. You don't have a right to access every aspect of my life, to weaponize your concern as a way to control my choices, or to treat me like a problem that needs solving. So what are we supposed to do? Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. Just watch. You change into someone we don't know and pretend everything's fine? Isabel studied her sister's face, seeing genuine distress mixed with something else. Fear. Fear that if Isabel could change, could establish boundaries and prioritize her own needs, what did that mean for the rest of them? You could try getting to know who I actually am, instead of mourning the version of me that never really existed, Isabel said gently. You could respect my decisions even when you don't understand them. You could trust that I'm capable of managing my own life. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But are you? Dorothy's question came out sharper than intended. Managing your life, I mean. Because from where we sit, it looks like you're throwing away everything that matters. Your marriage, your faith, your family relationships. My marriage was over long before the divorce papers, Isabel interrupted. My relationship with the church became toxic when spirituality turned into performance and judgment. And my family relationships? Well, that's what we're discussing right now, isn't it? She walked to the mantelpiece, looking at the family. Photos arranged there like evidence of better times. Isabel at 16, graduation day, forcing a smile while her mother adjusted her cap. Isabel at 22, wedding day, looking like she was about to faint. Isabel at 30, Christmas morning, the year before everything started falling apart, still trying to be the daughter who never caused problems. I know this is hard for all of you, she said without turning around. I know it's easier when everyone stays in their assigned roles, when nobody asks uncomfortable questions or makes waves, but I can't do that anymore. Why not? The question came from Marcus, and his voice held genuine confusion. Why can't you just be happy with what you have? Isabel turned to face him. Because what I had was slowly killing me. Not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently. Every day I spent trying to be who you needed me to be instead of who I actually am was a day I lost a little bit more of myself. That's very dramatic, don't you think? Dorothy said. Killing you? Really? Do you remember what I was like 2 years ago, Mom? Dorothy's expression softened slightly. You were going through a rough patch. I was having panic attacks every morning. I was taking sleeping pills to get 4 hours of rest. I cried in my car after every family dinner because I felt like such a failure for not being able to make everyone happy. I was seeing a doctor for stress-related stomach problems and a therapist for anxiety and depression. The room went very quiet. You never told us, Rebecca started. Because I knew exactly what would happen, Isabel said. You would have wanted to fix it by getting me to change my behavior instead of addressing the underlying problems, just like now. She walked back to the center of the room, no longer avoiding the defendant's chair, but not sitting in it either. The therapy helped me understand something important. I spent 32 years trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect family member. I was so focused on meeting everyone else's expectations that I never developed a relationship with myself. I never learned what I actually wanted, what made me happy, what I needed to feel fulfilled. And what you discovered was that family isn't important? Dorothy's voice carried years of hurt. What I discovered was that family relationships should be based on love and acceptance, not control and obligation. What I learned was that caring about someone doesn't give you the right to manage their life for them. Isabel pulled her phone from her purse and set it on the coffee table. Before I came here today, I received 17 text messages from various family members. Aunt Linda asking if I'm eating enough. Cousin Sarah wants to know if I need prayer. Uncle Robert sent me job listings for positions I never expressed interest in. Rebecca checked to see if I remembered about today's meeting. Marcus asked if I needed him to look at my car because I mentioned getting an oil change. She gestured to the phone. 17 messages about my life from people who claim they don't know anything about what's going on with me. Does anyone else see the contradiction there? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. We're just trying to help. By assuming I'm incapable of handling basic adult responsibilities? By treating every piece of information I share as evidence that I need rescue or guidance? Isabel's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. When I mentioned getting an oil change, it was conversational small talk, not a cry for automotive assistance. When I said I was trying a new restaurant, it wasn't an invitation for nutritional advice. Rebecca was crying quietly now, tears she was trying to hide by looking down at her hands. We just miss you, Izzy. We miss feeling close to you. You miss feeling in control, Isabel said, not unkindly. What you're interpreting as closeness was actually enmeshment. I shared everything because I thought I had to, not because I wanted to. I asked for advice on decisions I was perfectly capable of making because I thought that's what good daughters do. I prioritized family harmony over my own needs because I believed that's what love looked like. Dorothy stood up, her composure finally cracking. So we're the bad guys now? Everything wrong with your life is our fault? Nothing wrong with my life is anyone's fault, Isabel replied. That's the point you're missing. You keep treating my growth as a crisis, my independence as rejection, my boundaries as hostility. You've convinced yourselves that I'm falling apart when actually, I'm finally putting myself together. She picked up her phone and slipped it back into her purse. I came here today because I thought maybe we could have an honest conversation about how to build healthier relationships with each other. But this isn't a conversation. This is an ambush designed to pressure me into returning to patterns that were harmful to everyone involved. Harmful to everyone? Marcus stood up too, his frustration boiling over. How exactly was caring about you harmful to us? Isabel looked at her brother, really looked at him, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he carried the weight of trying to be the family's emotional caretaker since their father's death. When was the last time you did something for yourself, Marcus? Something that wasn't about work or family or fixing someone else's problems? His jaw worked silently for several seconds. This isn't about me. When was the last time? You went on a date? Took a vacation? Had a conversation with Mom that wasn't about someone in the family who needed help or intervention? Stop it, Dorothy said sharply. Don't turn this around. But Isabel wasn't turning anything around. She was illuminating something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Rebecca, when was the last time you made a major decision without polling the family for opinions? When did you last say no to hosting a holiday because you were tired? Or needed space? Rebecca's tears were falling freely now. Why are you doing this? Because enmeshment doesn't just hurt the person being controlled. It hurts everyone in the system. You've all sacrificed parts of yourselves to maintain family cohesion, and then you've demanded the same sacrifice from me. But when everyone is responsible for everyone else's emotions and choices, nobody gets to truly be themselves. Isabel walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. I love all of you, but I won't set myself on fire to keep you warm anymore, and I won't pretend that learning to prioritize my own well-being is a mental health crisis that requires intervention. Where are you going? Dorothy's voice was small, frightened. Home, Isabel said simply. To my apartment, to my life, to continue building the relationship with myself that I should have developed decades ago. She opened the front door, then paused. This didn't have to be adversarial. If you had approached me with curiosity instead of judgment, with questions instead of ultimatums, with respect instead of concern trolling, we might have found a way forward together. The last thing she heard as she closed the door behind her was Rebecca's quiet sob, and her mother's whispered, "What did we do wrong?" Isabel walked to her car with steady steps, her heels clicking on the brick pathway with the same authority they had carried when she arrived. But something had shifted during the confrontation. The clarity she had felt that morning had crystallized into something harder, more permanent. As she drove away from Millbrook Heights, Isabel realized that the family meeting had accomplished something, just not what anyone had intended. It had shown her exactly how far they were willing to go to maintain the illusion of closeness, and it had shown her exactly how far she was willing to go to protect the authentic life she was building. Her phone buzzed with incoming texts, but she didn't look at them. Instead, she drove toward downtown, toward the office building where she had an appointment at 4 p.m. An appointment her family didn't know about. An appointment with a lawyer who specialized in a very different kind of family planning than what her relatives had in mind. The irony wasn't lost on her. While they had been planning an intervention about her mental state, she had been consulting with a professional about their living state, specifically about the financial and legal entanglements that had kept her tied to family dynamics she was working to change. Isabel Martinez was done being rescued. It was time to see what real independence looked like, with proper legal documentation and professional boundaries to protect it. The family meeting was over, but Isabel's meeting was just beginning. The law offices of Sullivan and Associates occupied the entire 15th floor of the Meridian Tower, a gleaming testament to corporate success in the heart of downtown. Isabel rode the elevator in silence, watching the floor numbers climb while her pulse remained surprisingly steady. The anxiety that had plagued her for years seemed to have been replaced by something more reliable: purpose. Attorney Patricia Sullivan was nothing like Isabel had expected. Instead of the stern, power-suited dragon she had imagined, Patricia was a woman in her early 50s with laugh lines around intelligent hazel eyes and silver hair pulled into a practical bun. She wore a charcoal wool dress that spoke of quiet, authority rather than aggressive intimidation. "Ms. Martinez," Patricia said, extending a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming in today. I've reviewed the documents you sent ahead, and I have to say, your situation is more common than you might think." They settled into Patricia's office, a space that managed to be both professional and welcoming. Diplomas and legal texts shared, wall space with family photos, and a small collection of succulents that suggested someone who believed in nurturing things carefully over time. "Before we discuss specifics," Patricia said, opening a leather portfolio, "I want to make sure I understand your goals. You mentioned on the phone that you're concerned about financial boundaries with family members. Can you elaborate on that?" Isabel had practiced this conversation in her head dozens of times, but sitting here now, the words felt both easier and more significant than she had anticipated. 3 years ago, when my marriage started falling apart, my family stepped in to help financially. At the time, I was grateful. My mother paid my car insurance for 6 months. My brother covered my utility deposits when I moved out. My sister bought me groceries when I was between jobs. Patricia nodded, making notes on a yellow legal pad. And now? Now I realize it didn't help. It was an investment in control. Isabel pulled a folder from her purse, organized with the same precision she had once applied to marketing campaigns. "I've been tracking the pattern. Every financial favor comes with strings attached. My mother mentions car insurance whenever I decline family events. Marcus brings up the utility deposits when I make decisions he doesn't approve of. Rebecca uses the grocery money as evidence that I can't take care of myself. Have you attempted to repay any of these amounts?" "All of them," Isabel said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. Certified checks, sent via registered mail, with formal letters thanking them for their help and stating that I was now in a position to repay their kindness. Every single check was returned to me with a note saying, "Family doesn't keep score." Patricia examined the returned checks and accompanying letters. Isabel watched her eyebrows rise slightly as she read. Your mother's note is particularly interesting, Patricia said. She explicitly states that accepting repayment would damage the family bond, and that your attempt to pay her back is hurtful and unnecessary. But then she references the financial help in this text message from last week. Isabel had included screenshots of family communications as evidence of the behavioral patterns. Seeing them laid out in a legal context made the manipulation tactics more obvious than they had been when she was living inside them. That's the cycle, Isabel explained. They refuse to let me establish financial independence by accepting repayment, but they maintain the debt as emotional leverage. It's genius, really. I can never fully separate from family dynamics because I'm perpetually in their debt, but I also can never resolve the debt because accepting payment would acknowledge that it was a transaction rather than family love. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying Isabel with the expression of someone who had seen this particular game played many times before. What prompted you to seek legal advice now? Today's family meeting. Isabel briefly outlined the intervention, focusing on the specific language her family had used and the assumptions they had made about her mental state and decision-making capacity. I realized that their pattern of financial help followed. By emotional manipulation could potentially escalate into something more serious. If they genuinely believe I'm mentally unstable, what's to stop them from taking more drastic measures? Patricia set down her pen and gave Isabel her full attention. Such as? Medical intervention they believe I need, but refuse. Financial decisions they think I'm incapable of making. Living arrangements they consider more appropriate. Isabel paused, choosing her words carefully. My mother still has a key to my apartment, despite my asking for it back multiple times. She's used it 3 times in the past month, always with the excuse that she was worried and needed to check on me. That's concerning on multiple levels, Patricia said. Do you have documentation of these incidents? Isabel opened her phone and showed Patricia a series of photos. I started taking pictures after the second time. Moved items, food left in my refrigerator, notes left on my counter. When I confronted her about it, she said she was helping by cleaning up and making sure I was eating properly. Patricia studied the photos carefully. These show a clear pattern of unauthorized entry and boundary violations. Combined with the financial leverage tactics and today's coordinated family intervention, we're looking at a systematic attempt to maintain control over your adult life. Is that illegal? Some of it crosses legal boundaries, yes. But more importantly for your situation, all of it creates vulnerability for you if their campaign of concern escalates. Patricia pulled out a different folder and began explaining the legal protections available to Isabel. Advance directives that would prevent family members from making medical decisions on her behalf if she were ever incapacitated. Financial powers of attorney that would designate trusted friends rather than relatives to handle her affairs. Legal documentation that would establish her mental competency and decision-making capacity as of this date. Think of these as insurance policies, Patricia explained. If your family ever attempts to have you declared mentally incompetent or unable to manage your own affairs, these documents establish a legal record of your clear thinking and careful planning as of today. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. Do you think they would actually try something like that? I think people who believe they know what's best for someone else can justify increasingly extreme interventions when their gentler methods fail, Patricia said carefully. Your family's behavior suggests they view your independence and boundary setting as symptoms of mental illness rather than signs of healthy development. That mindset can lead to escalation. They spent the next hour going through various legal documents and protections. Isabel signed papers designating her therapist, Dr. Amanda Chen, as a professional witness to her mental competency. She completed forms giving medical power of attorney to her closest friend, Jessica Williams, rather than any family member. She established legal documentation that her apartment was her private residence and that no family member had permission to enter without explicit invitation. Now, Patricia said, pulling out one final document, Let's discuss the nuclear option. The phrase sent another chill through Isabel. Nuclear option? A cease and desist letter to your family members, specifically prohibiting certain behaviors and establishing legal consequences if they continue. Patricia handed Isabel a draft letter. This would formally document their pattern of harassment, financial manipulation, and boundary violations. It would legally require them to stop the unwanted contact, return your apartment key, and cease discussing your personal affairs with third parties. Isabel read through the letter, recognizing her own experiences translated into legal language. Seeing her family's behavior described in terms of harassment and stalking was jarring, but accurate. What would happen if I sent this? It would establish a legal paper trail if their behavior escalates to the point where you need to seek a restraining order. It would also make crystal clear that their current tactics are not welcome and will have legal consequences if they continue. And what would happen to our relationships? Patricia's expression softened slightly. That's not a question I can answer legally, but I can tell you that in my experience, families who respect boundaries will adjust their behavior when those boundaries are clearly communicated and legally enforced. Families who don't respect boundaries will escalate their tactics until they're stopped by external consequences. Isabel stared at the cease and desist letter, understanding that signing it would represent a point of no return. Her family would receive legal documentation that their daughter, sister, and niece was willing to pursue legal action to protect her independence. I need time to think about this last part, she said finally. Of course. Everything else we've completed today will be processed and filed within 48 hours. The cease and desist letter can be sent whenever you decide you're ready, if you decide you're ready. Patricia walked Isabel to the reception area but stopped her before she reached the elevator. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that what you're doing takes tremendous courage. It's not easy to legally protect yourself from people who claim to love you, especially when they've convinced themselves that their control is care. Sometimes it doesn't feel like courage, Isabel admitted. Sometimes it feels like betrayal. Betrayal? Of what? Isabel considered the question. The version of myself they need me to be. The family dynamic that's worked for everyone else. The idea that blood relation automatically equals healthy relationship. And what does it feel like the rest of the time? Isabel stepped into the elevator and turned back to face Patricia. Like survival. The elevator doors closed, and Isabel watched the floor numbers descend back toward ground level. In her purse, she carried copies of legal documents that established her as a competent adult capable of making her own decisions. In her phone, she had Patricia's direct number and instructions to call immediately if her family's behavior escalated beyond what she could handle alone. The late afternoon sun slanted through the lobby windows as Isabel walked toward the parking garage. She felt simultaneously lighter and heavier than she had that morning. Lighter because she had taken concrete steps to protect herself. Heavier because she now understood the full scope of what protection might require. Her phone buzzed, with a text from Rebecca. Isabel, please call me. We need to talk about what happened today. I'm worried about the things you said. Isabel stared at the message, seeing it now through the lens of everything Patricia had explained. The request masked concern. The immediate attempt to re-engage after she had clearly established boundaries. The focus on Isabel's behavior rather than any self-reflection about the family's tactics. She deleted the message without responding. As she drove home through downtown traffic, Isabel reflected on how dramatically her day had shifted. That morning, she had prepared for a family intervention about her mental state. This evening, she was returning from a legal consultation about protecting herself from that very family. The irony was sharp, but not surprising. The same people who claimed she couldn't take care of herself had necessitated hiring a lawyer to maintain her independence from their care. Isabel's apartment building came into view, and she felt a familiar sense of sanctuary. This was her space, legally protected now in ways it hadn't been that morning. No one could enter without permission. No one could use financial leverage to influence her decisions. No one could claim she was mentally incompetent without confronting legal documentation to the contrary. She parked in her assigned spot and sat in her car for several minutes, watching other residents come and go from their own independent lives. Normal people dealing with normal problems, making their own choices and living with their own consequences without family tribunals and intervention strategies. Isabel's phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. She let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes later, it rang again. Dorothy's name this time. She let that go to voicemail too. Before she could reach her apartment door, the phone rang a third time. Rebecca, calling back. Isabel turned off her phone entirely. In the silence of her apartment, she made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table with the legal documents Patricia had given her. Each page represented a piece of independence she had fought to establish and now had the legal framework to protect. The irony of needing legal protection from family love was not lost on her. But as Isabel reviewed the documentation of their financial manipulation, unauthorized apartment entries, and coordinated attempts to control her life choices, she understood that what her family called love was actually something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. She thought about the cease and desist letter, still unsigned in her purse. Patricia had been right about it being a nuclear option. Sending it would essentially declare war on the family dynamic that had shaped her entire life. But not sending it might mean remaining trapped in that dynamic forever, always vulnerable to escalating interventions whenever her choices didn't align with their expectations. Isabel finished her tea and walked to her bedroom, where she laid out clothes for tomorrow. Professional attire again, because she had another appointment scheduled. This one with her bank, to establish new accounts that no family member would have any information about or access to. The financial independence Patricia had discussed wasn't just about repaying old debts. It was about creating systems that couldn't be infiltrated by well-meaning relatives who believed they knew better than Isabel did about how she should live her life. As she prepared for bed, Isabel reflected on how much her world had changed in a single day. That morning, she had been dreading a family meeting about her mental state. Now she was planning the final steps of establishing complete independence from the people who had raised her. It wasn't the outcome anyone had expected from the day's events. But it was the outcome that had become necessary when love revealed itself to be control, and concern proved to be manipulation dressed in caring language. Isabel set her alarm for 7 a.m. Tomorrow would bring new conversations with new professionals, who specialized in helping people protect themselves from the very relationships that were supposed to be their greatest source of safety and support. The family meeting about her mental state was over. But the legal process of protecting that mental state from further family interference was just beginning. Isabel's phone displayed 47 missed calls when she turned it back on Thursday morning. 17 from Dorothy, 12 from Rebecca, 9 from Marcus, and the rest distributed among various aunts, uncles, and cousins who had apparently been mobilized overnight. Her voice box was full. She deleted all the voicemails without listening to them, and drove to First National Bank with the same purposeful calm that had carried her through the previous day's legal appointments. The financial advisor, Robert Chen, was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who specialized in what he diplomatically called family financial boundary situations. Patricia Sullivan had recommended him specifically for clients who needed to establish independence from relatives who used money as a relationship weapon. The most important thing, Robert explained as they sat in his private office, is creating financial systems that exist entirely outside your family's knowledge or influence. New accounts at a different bank, with statements going to a post office box, using only your individual credit history. Isabel had already closed her joint account from her marriage, but Robert helped her understand the subtler financial vulnerabilities she hadn't considered. Her car insurance was still in her mother's name from those 6 months of help. Her cell phone plan was part of a family bundle that Marcus managed, ostensibly to save everyone money. Even her gym membership had Rebecca listed as an emergency. Contact with authorization to make account changes. These seem like small things, Robert said, pulling up forms on his computer. But they create dozens of touch points where family members can access information about your life or make changes to your arrangements. Each one is a potential pressure point. They spent 2 hours systematically dismantling every financial connection that gave Isabel's family any insight into or control over her resources. New checking and savings accounts with only her name and signature authority. A credit card with paperless statements sent to a new email address. Investment accounts that would never appear on documents her relatives might accidentally or intentionally encounter. The goal, Robert explained, is creating what we call financial invisibility. Your family can't manipulate what they can't see, and they can't pressure you about choices they don't know you're making. Isabel signed form after form, each one representing another step away from the financial enmeshment that had kept her tethered to family drama. The process felt both liberating and terrifying. As they finalized the new accounts, Robert asked a question that caught Isabel off guard. Have you considered what you'll do if they escalate their response to your boundary setting? What do you mean? Robert leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. In my experience, families who use financial leverage to control adult children don't simply accept the loss of that leverage quietly. They often respond with increased pressure, manufactured crisis, or attempts to create new financial vulnerabilities. Isabel thought about the 47 missed calls on her phone. Such as? Medical emergencies that require your immediate financial assistance. Family members who suddenly can't make their mortgage payments and need help. Accusations that your financial independence is selfish or hurtful, designed to guilt you into re-engaging with the old patterns. The accuracy of his predictions was unsettling. Isabel could already imagine Dorothy calling about unexpected medical bills, or Marcus claiming his business was struggling and he needed a loan, or Rebecca tearfully, explaining that her children needed something expensive that only Isabel could provide. How do I handle that? By remembering that creating a crisis to restore control is manipulation, not genuine emergency. By maintaining your new boundaries even when the pressure intensifies. And by documenting any attempts to use manufactured urgency to override your financial independence. Isabel left the bank with a folder of new account information and a clear understanding that her family's response to her growing independence would likely intensify before it improved. The thought should have been frightening, but instead she felt oddly relieved. At least now she knew what to expect. Her next stop was the post office, where she rented a box for her new financial statements and any legal correspondence. The postal worker, a cheerful woman named Sandra, didn't ask why a local resident needed mail forwarding services, but her kind efficiency suggested she had helped many people establish private communication channels. Box 247, Sandra said, handing Isabel the keys. Your mail will be held securely here, and you can check it at your convenience. We're open until 6 on weekdays, 4 on Saturdays. Isabel tested the lock twice, satisfying herself that this small metal box represented something larger, a space that belonged entirely to her, where information could reach her without passing through any family filters or observers. Her phone buzzed with another call from Rebecca. Isabel declined it and drove to her therapist's office, where Dr. Amanda Chen was waiting with the calm, unflappable presence that had helped Isabel navigate the past 18 months of personal rebuilding. You look different today, Amanda observed, as Isabel settled into the familiar armchair across from her desk. Less tense than usual. Isabel described the events of the past 2 days, the family intervention, the legal consultation, the financial restructuring. Amanda listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, but mostly maintaining the steady attention that had taught Isabel the difference between being heard and being managed. How do you feel about the steps you've taken? Amanda asked, when Isabel finished. Powerful, Isabel said immediately, then paused, surprised by her own response, and guilty about feeling powerful. Say more about the guilt. Isabel considered the question carefully. I was raised to believe that independence from family was selfishness, that putting my needs first was betraying the people who loved me, that healthy families don't need legal documents and financial boundaries because love should be enough. And now? Now I understand that love without respect for autonomy isn't love at all. It's possession disguised as care. Isabel looked out the window at the afternoon light filtering through the trees. But understanding that intellectually and feeling okay about it emotionally are two different things. Amanda nodded. You're grieving the loss of the family dynamic you thought you had, while simultaneously protecting yourself from the family dynamic you actually had. That's complicated work. They spent the session exploring Isabel's complex feelings about establishing legal and financial independence from people she genuinely loved, even as she acknowledged that their version of love had become toxic to her well-being. One thing I want you to consider, Amanda said as their time wound down, is that your family's response to your boundaries will tell you everything you need to know about whether your assessment of the situation was accurate. What do you mean? Healthy. People respect boundaries, even when they don't understand them. They might feel hurt or confused, but they adjust their behavior to honor the limits you've set. Unhealthy people escalate their pressure when boundaries are established, because the boundaries threaten their control. Isabel drove home from therapy with Amanda's words echoing in her mind. Her family's response to her growing independence would be the ultimate test of whether their concern was genuine care or control disguised as love. She didn't have to wait long to find out. Her apartment building's parking lot contained an unexpected visitor. Marcus's black pickup truck sat in the guest parking area, and Marcus himself was leaning against her building's entrance door, arms crossed and expression grim. Isabel parked in her usual spot and walked toward the entrance with deliberate calm, keys ready in her hand. We need to talk, Marcus said without preamble. No, we don't, Isabel replied, moving to unlock the building door. Marcus stepped sideways, blocking her path. Isabel, this has gone far enough. Mom's been crying all night. Rebecca thinks you hate us. We need to figure this out. Step aside, Marcus. Not until you explain what the hell happened to you. Yesterday you were family. Today you're acting like we're strangers. Isabel looked at her brother, really looked at him, saw the confusion and hurt in his face, but also the expectation that his physical presence and emotional pressure would override her clearly stated boundaries. Saw the assumption that his needs and the family's distress should take priority over her explicitly communicated desire for space. Marcus, I'm going to say this once. Move away from the door and let me enter my building. Or what? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with challenge and the history of a family dynamic where Isabel had never enforced consequences for boundary violations. Isabel pulled out her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I'm Ben. Being prevented from entering my apartment building by someone who won't let me pass when I've asked them to move. Marcus's eyes widened. Isabel, what the hell? Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? I don't know. The person blocking my path is my brother, and he's refusing to respect my request to let me go home. We're sending an officer to your location. Stay on the line. Marcus stepped away from the door immediately, hands raised as if Isabel were pointing a weapon at him instead of a phone. Jesus Christ, Isabel. I can't believe you just called the police on your own brother. Isabel unlocked the building door but didn't disconnect the call. Officer, the person has moved away from the door. I'm able to enter my building now. Would you like us to continue responding to document the incident? Isabel looked at Marcus, who was staring at her with a mixture of shock and something that might have been fear. Yes, please. I'd like to file a report. The police officer arrived within 10 minutes, a calm, professional woman named Officer Rivera, who had clearly dealt with family disputes before. She took statements from both Isabel and Marcus, documenting the incident with the same thorough attention to detail that Isabel was learning to value from all the professionals now helping her establish and maintain independence. "Mr. Martinez," Officer Rivera said to Marcus after hearing both sides, "your sister has the right to enter her home without interference, regardless of your family relationship. Blocking someone's access to their residence can constitute harassment or unlawful detention, even when your intentions are to resolve a conflict." Marcus's face reddened. "She's my sister. We were just trying to talk. She asked you to move, and you refused. When someone says no to a conversation, continuing to press the issue becomes harassment." Officer Rivera handed Marcus a card. "I strongly suggest you respect her boundaries and find other ways to communicate if she's willing to engage." After Marcus left and Officer Rivera completed her report, Isabel sat in her apartment feeling the weight of what had just happened. She had called the police on her own brother. 6 months ago, such an action would have been unthinkable. Today, it had felt like the natural consequence of a boundary violation. Her phone rang. Dorothy's name on the screen. Isabel answered on the third ring. "Isabel Marie Martinez, I cannot believe what Marcus just told me." Her mother's voice was shaking with fury and hurt. "You called the police on your brother? Your own flesh and blood? I called the police when someone blocked my access to my home and refused to move when I asked them to. He's your brother. He was trying to help. He was trying to force a conversation I didn't consent to have. This is insane, Isabel. This whole thing is insane. We love you. We're worried about you. And you're treating us like criminals." Isabel felt the familiar tug of guilt. The lifelong programming that told her family distress meant she needed to fix something, apologize for something, sacrifice something to restore harmony. But underneath the guilt was something stronger now. The recognition that her mother's pain didn't obligate Isabel to abandon her boundaries. "Mom, I love you too, but love doesn't give anyone the right to ignore my clearly stated limits." "What limits? When did you become someone who sets limits on family?" "When I realized that family relationships need boundaries just like any other relationships. When I understood that love without respect for autonomy becomes control." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I don't know who you are anymore," Dorothy said finally, her voice breaking. "I'm the same person I've always been. I'm just not hiding it anymore to make everyone else comfortable." Dorothy hung up without saying goodbye. Isabel set her phone on the coffee table and looked around her apartment, her sanctuary, her space, her home that was now legally protected from unauthorized entry and emotionally protected by boundaries. She was finally willing to enforce. The day had brought new challenges, but also new evidence that her assessment of the family dynamic was accurate. Marcus had attempted to physically intimidate her into compliance. Dorothy had tried emotional manipulation. Both had responded to her boundary setting with escalation rather than respect. Amanda had been right. Their response told her everything. She needed to know about whether legal and financial protection had been necessary. Isabel made herself dinner and ate it in peaceful silence, her phone turned off and her apartment door secured with new locks she had installed that morning. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of relationships and boundaries, love and control, family dynamics, and individual autonomy. Inside, Isabel Martinez continued the difficult work of building a life that belonged entirely to herself, protected by law and maintained by the kind of self-respect she was still learning to trust. The envelope was waiting under Isabel's apartment door when she returned from her morning run on Friday. Thick cream paper with Martinez family embossed on the return address, her Uncle Robert's law firm letterhead. Isabel's stomach dropped as she recognized the implications. Her family had hired a lawyer. She opened the envelope in her kitchen, hands steadier than she expected. The letter was formal but not hostile, requesting a family mediation session to address recent misunderstandings and restore healthy communication patterns. It suggested that Isabel's recent behavioral changes might be influenced by external parties and that professional mediation could help clarify any misconceptions about family intentions. The language was careful, legally precise, but the message was clear. They were challenging her mental state and decision-making capacity through official channels. Isabel photographed the letter and immediately called Patricia Sullivan. "I was expecting this," Patricia said after Isabel read the letter over the phone. "Your family is escalating exactly as we discussed. They're trying to frame your independence as mental instability requiring professional intervention. What do I do?" First, don't respond to the mediation request directly. Any response could be interpreted as acknowledgement that their concerns have merit. Second, come in this afternoon so we can prepare your defense. Isabel arrived at Patricia's office at 2 p.m. with copies of every document from the past week: the police report from Marcus's harassment, her new financial account paperwork, and the family mediation request. "Here's what they're doing," Patricia explained, spreading the documents across her conference table. "They're building a case that you're mentally incompetent by framing your boundary setting as irrational behavior. The mediation request mentions external influences, which suggests they plan to argue that your therapist or lawyer has manipulated you into making harmful decisions." The strategy was sophisticated and terrifying. Isabel realized her family wasn't just trying to restore the old dynamic. They were attempting to legally establish that she lacked the capacity to make independent choices. "The good news," Patricia continued, "is that we documented your competency before they made this move. Your mental health evaluation, the financial planning sessions, the careful legal preparations. All of this demonstrates clear thinking and rational decision-making." Patricia pulled out a new document. "I think it's time to send that cease and desist letter we discussed. Your family has now involved lawyers and are questioning your mental capacity. This has moved beyond family drama into legal territory." Isabel stared at the letter that would formally demand her family stop their harassment and manipulation tactics. Signing it would make their conflict official, documented, irreversible. What happens after I send this? One of two things. Either they respect the legal boundaries and step back, or they escalate further and we pursue a restraining order. Either way, you'll have legal protection and documentation of their behavior. Isabel signed the letter with a hand that barely trembled. That evening, Isabel met her friend Jessica Williams at their favorite coffee shop downtown. Jessica was the only person outside her therapy sessions who knew the full scope of what Isabel was dealing with, and her perspective had become invaluable. "So they hired a lawyer to prove you're crazy for hiring a lawyer to protect yourself from them," Jessica said, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "The irony is almost artistic." "It's not funny, Jess. I know it's not. But you have to admit there's something darkly comic about people who claim to love you hiring legal representation to challenge your right to legal representation." Jessica was right, but Isabel felt too drained to appreciate the absurdity. "What if they're successful? What if they convince someone that I really am having a breakdown?" "Isabel, look at yourself. You've handled this entire situation with more clarity and strategic thinking than most people apply to choosing what to have for lunch. You've documented everything, sought professional help, established legal protections, and maintained your boundaries under extreme pressure. If that's mental illness, then sanity is overrated." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching other customers navigate their own Friday evening problems: work stress, relationship drama, weekend plans. Normal complications that didn't require lawyers or police reports or cease and desist letters. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just stayed in the old pattern?" Jessica asked. "If you had kept being the version of yourself that made everyone comfortable?" Isabel considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes. It would have been easier in some ways. No family meetings, no lawyers, no police. Reports. Just quiet misery and the slow erosion of everything that makes me who I am. And now? Now I have a life that belongs to me, even if I have to fight for it every day? Jessica raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. To fighting for yourself, even when the people who claim to love you make it a war. Isabel's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Rebecca. I got a new phone because you blocked my old number. Please call me. We need to talk about what's happening to our family. Isabel showed the message to Jessica, who shook her head in amazement. She got a new phone to circumvent your boundary. That's not love, Isabel. That's stalking. Isabel blocked the new number and added it to the documentation she was keeping for Patricia. Every boundary violation, every attempt to override her clearly stated limits, every escalation in their campaign to restore control, all of it was being carefully recorded. The weekend passed quietly. Isabel had turned off her old phone entirely and was using only the new number that her family didn't have. The silence was profound after months of constant calls, texts, and unexpected visits. For the first time in years, Isabel spent 2 full days without managing anyone else's emotions or defending her life choices. She cleaned her apartment thoroughly, reorganized her closets, and cooked elaborate meals for one. She read an entire novel without interruption. She took long baths and watched movies she actually wanted to see. She remembered what it felt like to live according to her own rhythm, instead of constantly anticipating the next family crisis or intervention. On Sunday evening, Isabel realized that the anxiety that had plagued her for years was almost completely gone. The constant vigilance, the perpetual readiness to justify her choices or soothe someone else's concerns, all of it had disappeared along with her family's access to her daily life. Monday morning brought a call from Patricia. The cease and desist letters were delivered this morning by certified mail, Patricia reported. Your family now has formal legal notice that their behavior constitutes harassment and that continued violations will result in restraining orders. How? Long before we know how they'll respond? Usually within 48 hours. Either they'll respect the boundaries and step back, or they'll escalate with more dramatic tactics. Emergency calls, showing up at your workplace, enlisting other family members or friends to pressure you on their behalf. Patricia was right about the timeline. Tuesday afternoon brought a call to Isabel's office from her supervisor, Linda Harper. Isabel, your mother called here looking for you. She said there was a family emergency and she needed to reach you immediately. Isabel's heart rate spiked, but her voice remained calm. Did she specify what kind of emergency? She said your brother was in the hospital and you weren't answering your phone. Isabel pulled out her new phone and called Marcus's number. He answered on the second ring, clearly at work based on the background noise. Isabel, why are you calling me? Mom told my supervisor you were in the hospital. There was a long pause. I'm not in the hospital. I'm at the construction site. Why would she say that? Isabel hung up and called her supervisor back. Linda, I just spoke to my brother. He's not in the hospital. My mother created a false emergency to try to contact me at work? Oh. Linda's voice carried a mixture of concern and awkwardness. Should I not take calls from your family members? Please don't. And if anyone claims there's an emergency involving me or my family, please ask them to contact emergency services directly rather than routing it through my workplace. Isabel documented the incident and called Patricia immediately. Manufactured emergency calls to your workplace, Patricia said grimly. That's harassment escalation, and it's affecting your professional reputation. We need to move quickly on. The restraining order. By Wednesday afternoon, Isabel had filed for a restraining order against Dorothy, Rebecca, and Marcus Martinez, citing documented harassment, manufactured emergencies, unauthorized apartment entry, and attempts to interfere. With her employment, the legal process was surreal. Isabel sat in a courthouse waiting room, surrounded by other people seeking protection from individuals who were supposed to care about them. Domestic violence victims, stalking survivors, people fleeing abusive relationships, and Isabel, seeking legal protection from her own family's version of love. The judge who reviewed her petition was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a matter-of-fact demeanor. Ms. Martinez, you're seeking restraining orders against your mother, sister, and brother. That's unusual but not unprecedented. Can you summarize the behavior that's led to this request? Isabel had prepared for this moment, but speaking the words out loud in a courtroom made everything feel more real and more final. Your Honor, my family has engaged in a pattern of harassment and manipulation designed to control my adult life. When I established boundaries, they escalated their tactics to include manufactured emergencies, unauthorized entry into my residence, attempts to interfere with my employment, and legal challenges to my mental competency. The judge reviewed the documentation Isabel and Patricia had prepared: police reports, photographs, bank records, medical evaluations, and the pattern of escalating harassment. I'm granting temporary restraining orders against all 3 individuals, the judge said finally. They are prohibited from contacting you directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of your residence or workplace, and from discussing your personal affairs with third parties. They'll have an opportunity to contest these orders at a hearing next month. Isabel left the courthouse with legal documents that formally protected her from her own family. The irony was profound, but so was the relief. For the first time in her adult life, she had official recognition that her boundaries mattered, and legal consequences for anyone who violated them. That evening, Isabel sat in her apartment with a glass of wine and the restraining order paperwork spread across her coffee table. She had spent the past week transforming from someone who couldn't say no to family requests into someone who had obtained legal protection from family harassment. The woman who had sat in that defendant's chair at the family meeting a week ago would never have imagined she was capable of such decisive action. But that woman had been operating under the assumption that family love meant accepting any behavior disguised as care. Isabel Martinez had learned the difference between love and control, between care and manipulation, between family loyalty and emotional imprisonment. The education had been painful and expensive, but it had been worth every difficult moment. Her phone, the new one her family couldn't access, remained blissfully quiet. Outside her apartment, the world continued, its complicated dance of relationships and boundaries. Inside, Isabel continued the work of building a life that belonged entirely to herself, protected by law, and maintained by the kind of self-respect she was finally learning to trust completely. 3 weeks after the restraining orders went into effect, Isabel's life had settled into a rhythm she barely recognized. Peaceful, predictable, and entirely her own. The constant vigilance that had defined her existence for years had been replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed: genuine relaxation. Her mornings began with coffee and silence instead of anxiety about what family crisis might be waiting in her voicemail. Her evenings ended with books or movies chosen for her own enjoyment, rather than activities designed to avoid difficult phone calls. The transformation was so profound that Isabel sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. The hearing to contest the restraining orders was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Isabel arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, wearing the same navy blazer she had chosen for the family meeting that had started this entire legal journey. Patricia Sullivan met her in the lobby carrying a thick folder of documentation. "How are you feeling?" Patricia asked as they walked toward the courtroom. "Strangely calm," Isabel replied. "I think I've been preparing for this moment longer than I realized." The courtroom was smaller than Isabel had expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly surreal. Her family sat on the opposite side of the room with their lawyer, Uncle Robert, who had been practicing family law for 30 years and had handled Isabel's parents' wills and real estate transactions since she was a child. Seeing Robert in an adversarial role was jarring. He had taught Isabel to ride a bike, attended her high school graduation, and given her advice about college applications. Now he was here to argue that she was mentally unstable and that her family's harassment was justified concern. Dorothy, Rebecca, and Marcus sat behind their lawyer, all dressed formally as if for church. Isabel tried to read their expressions but found herself looking at strangers. The people who had raised her, who had shaped her understanding of love and family, who had convinced her that their approval was necessary for her well-being. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the sterile courtroom environment. Judge Margaret Chen called the hearing to order and reviewed the temporary restraining orders that had been granted 3 weeks earlier. Isabel noticed that Judge Chen was roughly her mother's age and wondered if that would influence her perspective on family dynamics. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Chen addressed Uncle Robert, "you're representing the respondents in this matter. Please present your argument for why these restraining orders should be lifted." Robert stood with the confidence of someone who had argued hundreds of family cases. "Your Honor, we're dealing with a family in crisis. Ms. Isabel Martinez has been experiencing significant mental health challenges following her divorce and job loss. Her family's attempts to provide support and intervention have been mischaracterized as harassment." He opened a folder and began presenting his case. "The evidence shows that Ms. Martinez has isolated herself from her support system, made erratic financial decisions, and sought legal advice that has encouraged her to view normal family concern as threatening behavior. Her family's attempts to help have been reasonable and appropriate, given their legitimate concerns about her well-being." Isabel watched Uncle Robert present a version of her life that was technically accurate, but completely wrong in its interpretation. Yes, she had isolated herself from toxic dynamics that were harming her mental health. Yes, she had made significant financial decisions to establish independence from manipulation and control. Yes, she had sought legal advice to protect herself from escalating harassment. But in Robert's telling, these actions were symptoms of mental illness rather than signs of healthy boundary setting. Patricia stood to present Isabel's defense, and her approach was methodical and devastating. "Your Honor, the respondents have engaged in a systematic campaign to control Ms. Martinez's adult life under the guise of concern. When she established reasonable boundaries, they escalated their tactics to include manufactured emergencies, unauthorized entry into her residence, and attempts to interfere with her employment." Patricia presented the documentation they had carefully compiled: police reports, photographs, financial records, medical evaluations, and expert testimony from Dr. Amanda Chen about Isabel's mental competency and the therapeutic progress she had made. "Ms. Martinez is not mentally ill, Your Honor. She is a competent adult who has taken rational, well-documented steps to protect herself from family members who refuse to respect her autonomy. The respondents' behavior has escalated precisely because their previous methods of control were no longer effective." The testimony portion of the hearing was the most difficult part for Isabel. She had to take the stand and describe, in clinical detail, the pattern of manipulation and control that had shaped her family relationships for decades. "Can you describe the incident that led to the police report filed on March 15th? Patricia asked. "My brother physically blocked my access to my apartment building when I asked him to move aside and let me go home. When I asked him multiple times to step away from the door, he refused and said he wouldn't let me pass until I agreed to discuss family matters I had clearly stated I didn't want to discuss. What was your response?" "I called 911 because someone was preventing me from accessing my residence and refusing to respect my clearly stated boundaries." Isabel watched her family's faces as she testified. Dorothy looked stricken, as if she was hearing about these events for the first time. Rebecca was crying quietly, her shoulders shaking with what appeared to be genuine distress. Marcus stared at the floor, his jaw clenched in the stubborn line Isabel had known since childhood. Uncle Robert cross-examined Isabel with the skill of someone who had known her since she was 5 years old. He asked about her mental health history, her divorce, her job loss, and her decision to seek therapy. He questioned her judgment in hiring Patricia and suggested that her legal actions were evidence of paranoid thinking. "Ms. Martinez, Don't you think your family's concern about your welfare is reasonable given the significant changes in your life over the past 2 years? Isabel looked directly at Uncle Robert, this man who had been part of her life for 3 decades, and was now arguing that her family's harassment was justified concern. Mr. Martinez, my family's concern would be reasonable if it were actually about my welfare, but when someone refuses to accept repayment for financial help, and then uses that help as leverage to control my decisions, that's not concern, that's manipulation. When someone calls my workplace with false emergencies to circumvent my boundaries, that's not love, that's harassment. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Judge Chen took a brief recess to review the evidence before rendering her decision. This is a difficult case because it involves a family that clearly cares about each other, but has developed unhealthy patterns of interaction. Judge Chen began when court resumed. However, the evidence clearly shows that the respondents have engaged in behavior that constitutes harassment under the law. Isabel felt her heart rate slow as she realized which direction the judge's decision was heading. The respondents' intentions may have been loving, but their actions have violated Ms. Martinez's clearly established boundaries. The manufactured emergency call to her workplace, the unauthorized entry into her residence, and the physical obstruction of her access to her home are all behaviors that would constitute harassment regardless of the family relationship. Judge Chen looked directly at Dorothy, Rebecca, and Marcus. Love does not give anyone the right to ignore another person's boundaries or to override their autonomy. Ms. Martinez has the right to establish limits on her relationships, even with family members, and those limits must be respected. The restraining orders were made permanent, with provisions for modification if all parties agreed to participate in family therapy with a court-approved mediator. After the hearing, Isabel stood in the courthouse lobby feeling simultaneously victorious and exhausted. Patricia shook her hand with professional satisfaction. "You did beautifully up there," Patricia said. "Your testimony was clear, factual, and compelling. The judge understood exactly what was at stake." Isabel watched her family exit the courthouse through a different door, Uncle Robert shepherding them toward the parking garage with the efficient movements of someone managing a defeat. She wondered if she would ever see them again, and surprised herself by discovering that the thought didn't cause the panic she would have expected. "What happens now?" Isabel asked Patricia. "Now you live your life," Patricia replied simply. "The legal protections are in place. Your financial independence is established. Your boundaries are legally enforceable. Now, you get to discover who you are when you're not managing other people's emotions or defending your right to exist as an autonomous adult." Isabel drove home through the afternoon traffic, past the familiar landmarks of a city that felt different now that she was truly free to navigate it on her own terms. The apartment building that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like something more permanent. Home, in the deepest sense of the word. That evening, Isabel sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and her laptop open to a document titled Life Goals. For the first time in her adult life, she was making plans based entirely on her own desires and interests, without considering how those plans might affect family dynamics, or whether they would meet with approval from people who claimed to know what was best for her. She wanted to travel. She wanted to change careers. She wanted to date someone who saw her as an individual rather than as a role in a family system. She wanted to build friendships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. She wanted to discover what made her happy when happiness wasn't defined by other people's satisfaction with her choices. Isabel Martinez had spent 3 decades learning to be the person her family needed her to be. Now, at 34, she was finally free to discover who she actually was. The family meeting about her mental state had ended with legal documentation that her mental state was not only sound, but strong enough to protect itself from those who would undermine it in the name of love. The woman who had sat in that defendant's chair 6 weeks ago would never have imagined she was capable of such decisive self-protection. But that woman had been operating under the assumption that love meant accepting any behavior disguised as care. Isabel had learned the difference. And in learning that difference, she had finally learned how to love herself enough to demand that others treat her with the respect she deserved. Her phone, the one her family couldn't access, remained peacefully quiet. Outside her apartment, the world continued its complicated dance of relationships and boundaries. Inside, Isabel continued the joyful work of building a life that belonged entirely to herself, protected by law and maintained by the kind of self-respect she had finally learned to trust completely. The story that had begun with a family meeting about her mental state had ended with legal validation of her right to mental sovereignty. And for the first time in her life, Isabel Martinez was truly, completely free. 6 months after the court hearing, Isabel Martinez sat in a coffee shop she had never visited before, in a neighborhood she was still exploring, waiting for someone who represented everything her old life had taught her to fear: uncertainty. His name was David Chen, and he was a freelance graphic designer who had moved to the city from Portland 3 months ago. They had met at an art gallery opening that Isabel had attended alone, simply because the exhibition looked interesting and she no longer needed permission or companionship to pursue her curiosities. David was nothing like the men her family would have chosen for her. He was quiet where they would have preferred outgoing, artistic where they would have valued practical, and most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in who Isabel was rather than who she might become with the right guidance. "I've never dated someone who actually seems to like herself," David had said on their second date, and Isabel had realized he was right. For the first time in her adult life, she was entering a relationship as a complete person rather than as someone seeking validation or approval. Their third date had been a cooking class where they had laughed at their mutual inability to properly fold dumplings. Their fourth had been a hiking trail neither of them had tried before, where they had discovered a shared love of getting lost and finding their way back together. Their fifth had been a quiet evening at David's apartment, where Isabel had felt comfortable enough to share pieces of her story without feeling like she was being interviewed or evaluated. Now, 6 months into whatever they were building together, Isabel was preparing to introduce David to the concept of her family situation. Not because she needed his approval or advice, but because she wanted him to understand the context of her fierce independence and carefully maintained boundaries. "So your family hired a lawyer to prove you were mentally incompetent for hiring. A lawyer to protect yourself from them," David said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "That's like a philosophical paradox wrapped in a legal brief." Isabel laughed, appreciating his ability to find humor in situations that had once caused her tremendous pain. The irony wasn't lost on the judge either. "I think that's part of why she made the restraining orders permanent. Do you miss them?" The question was one Isabel had been asking herself regularly in therapy with Dr. Amanda Chen, who had helped her navigate the complex grief of losing relationships that had been both loving and toxic. "I miss the idea of them," Isabel said carefully. "I miss the fantasy of having a family that could love me without needing to control me. But I don't miss the actual relationships we had, because those relationships were slowly killing who I really am." David nodded, and Isabel appreciated that he didn't try to fix her sadness or suggest that she should try to reconcile with people who had refused to respect her boundaries. "What's the hardest part now?" he asked. Isabel considered the question, learning to trust my own judgment completely. "For 34 years, I made decisions based on what would cause the least family drama rather than what was best for me. Now I have to learn how to want things, how to choose things, how to prioritize my own needs without feeling guilty about it." She pulled out her phone and showed David a text message that had arrived that morning from an unknown number. "This is your cousin Sarah. I heard about what happened with the family. I think you should know that your mother has been having chest pains and won't see a doctor because she's too upset about losing you. Please call her." "How does that make you feel?" David asked after reading the message. "Angry," Isabel said immediately. Angry that they're still trying to manipulate me through manufactured health crises. Angry that they're using extended family members to circumvent the legal boundaries I've established. And angry that part of me still feels guilty for not rushing to fix whatever problem they're claiming exists. Isabel had learned to recognize these attempts at emotional manipulation for what they were. Carefully crafted messages designed to trigger her lifelong programming to prioritize family needs over her own well-being. But recognizing the manipulation didn't make it completely ineffective. Did you call your mother? No. I forwarded the message to my lawyer and blocked the number. If my mother is actually having health problems, she has access to medical care and family members who can help her. She doesn't need me to abandon my boundaries to prove that I care about her welfare. David reached across the table and took Isabel's hand. That must be incredibly difficult. It is. But it's also necessary. Every time I give in to one of these manufactured crises, I teach them that my boundaries are negotiable if they apply. Enough pressure, and I can't live that way anymore. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching other customers navigate their own Friday evening decisions. Isabel had learned to appreciate these ordinary moments, the luxury of being present in her own life without constantly managing other people's emotions or defending her choices. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "What would you have done differently if you could go back and handle the situation again?" Isabel had thought about this question many times during her therapy sessions. "I would have started setting boundaries much earlier, before the patterns became so entrenched. I would have recognized that my family's version of love was actually control disguised as care, and I would have trusted my own instincts instead of dismissing them as selfishness." "Any regrets about how you handled it?" "Only one," Isabel said. "I wish I had been brave enough to have honest conversations with them before it escalated to legal action. But I also understand why I wasn't brave enough. They had spent decades training me to believe that my needs were less important than family harmony." Isabel's phone buzzed with another message, this time from Jessica Williams. "Wine night at my place tomorrow? I have updates on Michael's situation, and I want to hear about your mysterious new boyfriend." Isabel smiled and typed back, "Yes to wine night, and David isn't mysterious. You just haven't met him yet because I'm taking things slowly." "Jessica's having a party tomorrow night," Isabel told David. "Would you like to meet my friends?" The question represented something significant. Isabel was building a social circle based on genuine compatibility rather than family obligation, and she was learning to integrate different parts of her life without seeking approval from anyone. "I'd like that," David said. "Though I should warn you, I'm not great at parties." "That's okay. They're not really parties. Just a few people talking and laughing. No pressure to perform or impress anyone." Isabel realized as she said it that this was another way her life had changed. Her social activities were now chosen for enjoyment, rather than obligation, and she surrounded herself with people who accepted her as she was, rather than people who wanted to modify her into someone more convenient. After coffee, they walked through the downtown area, past the law offices where Isabel had first met Patricia Sullivan, past the bank where she had established her financial independence, past the courthouse where she had legally protected her right to autonomy. The city had become a map of her liberation, each location marking another step in her journey toward authentic self-determination. "There's something I want to show you," Isabel said, leading David toward the Meridian Tower. They rode the elevator to the observation deck on the 20th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city at night. Isabel had discovered this place during one of her solitary explorations, and it had become a symbol of her new perspective on life. "When I was growing up," Isabel said, looking out at the lights spreading in all directions, "I thought the world was much smaller than this. I thought my family's approval was the only thing that mattered, that their version of love was the only kind available, that their expectations were the only valid measure of success." She pointed toward the Millbrook Heights neighborhood, barely visible in the distance. "I can see my childhood home from here. but it looks so small now, like a dollhouse in a much larger world. David stood beside her, not trying to fill the silence with commentary or advice, just sharing the moment with her. I used to be terrified of disappointing people, Isabel continued. Now I understand that disappointing people who want to control you is actually a sign that you're living authentically. What's the scariest part of your new life? David asked. Isabel considered the question seriously. The freedom. Having to make every decision based on what I actually want, rather than what will keep everyone else comfortable. It's terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. They stayed on the observation deck for another hour, talking about David's decision to leave his corporate job in Portland to pursue freelance design work, about Isabel's plans to eventually start her own marketing consulting business, about the ways they were both learning to build lives that reflected their authentic selves rather than other people's expectations. When they finally left the building, Isabel felt the familiar sense of possibility that had replaced the chronic anxiety of her old life. Every day brought new choices, new experiences, new opportunities to discover who she was when she wasn't performing a role designed to keep other people comfortable. I have a confession, David said as they walked toward their cars. I've been wanting to ask you something for weeks, but I wasn't sure if it was too soon. Isabel felt a flutter of anxiety, the old programming that interpreted any serious conversation as potential conflict or judgment. But she also felt curiosity, which was new and welcome. Ask me. I'm planning to visit my family in Portland next month for my niece's birthday. Would you want to come with me? The invitation was simple, but Isabel understood its significance. David was offering to introduce her to his family, to include her in his life in a way that suggested he saw their relationship as something with potential longevity. I'd like that, Isabel said, surprising herself with how quickly and easily the answer came. But I should probably warn you, I'm still learning how to navigate family dynamics in healthy ways. That's okay. My family is pretty low-key. They're more interested in making sure everyone has enough to eat than in managing anyone's life choices. Isabel tried to imagine what that would feel like, being in a family environment where acceptance was the default, rather than something that had to be earned through compliance and performance. What if they don't like me? She asked, voicing the fear that had shaped so many of her past relationships. Then they don't like you, David said simply. It wouldn't change how I feel about you, and it wouldn't mean there was anything wrong with you. It would just mean we weren't compatible, which is useful information but not a crisis. Isabel stared at him, processing the radical idea that other people's opinions of her could be acknowledged without becoming the defining factor in her self-worth or her relationship decisions. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. People either appreciate you for who you are or they don't. Either way, you get to keep being yourself. Isabel drove home that night thinking about the difference between simple and easy, between the complexity she had created trying to manage everyone else's emotions and the straightforward clarity of living according to her own values and needs. Her apartment felt different now than it had 6 months ago. Then, it had been a sanctuary from family pressure and external expectations. Now, it was simply home, a place that reflected her tastes, her choices, her personality, without any input from people who thought they knew better than she did about how she should live. Isabel made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table with a notebook, planning her goals for the next year. Travel to 3 new cities, launch her consulting business, take a pottery class she had been curious about for years, learn to rock climb, read 50 books, write in a journal every day, continue therapy to keep processing the ongoing work of building authentic relationships. None of these goals required anyone else's approval or assistance. None of them were designed to impress or please or appease anyone. They were simply things Isabel wanted to do because they interested her, challenged her, or brought her joy. The woman who had sat in that defendant's chair at the family meeting 8 months ago would never have imagined she was capable of such self-directed planning. But that woman had been operating under the assumption that her value was determined by other people's satisfaction with her choices. Isabel had learned the difference between being valued for who she was and being valued for how well she performed the role others needed her to play. And in learning that difference, she had discovered the kind of self-respect that made healthy relationships possible. Her phone buzzed with a final message of the day, from Dr. Amanda Chen confirming their therapy appointment for the following week. Looking forward to hearing about your continued progress. You've come so far. Isabel smiled, recognizing the truth in her therapist's observation. She had come far, not just in distance from her family's control, but in proximity to her own authentic self. The family meeting about her mental state had ended with legal documentation that her mental state was not only sound, but strong enough to protect itself from those who would undermine it in the name of love. The journey that had begun with a text message about a family intervention had culminated in a life built entirely on her own terms, protected by law and maintained by the kind of self-respect she had finally learned to trust completely. Isabel Martinez had spent 34 years learning to be the person her family needed her to be. Now, at 35, she was finally free to discover who she actually was, and every day brought new evidence that the person she actually was, independent, thoughtful, strong, and capable of setting boundaries without apology, was someone worth protecting, worth celebrating, and worth loving exactly as she was. The story that had begun with a family meeting about her mental state had ended with the kind of mental clarity and emotional freedom that most people only dream of achieving. And for the first time in her life, Isabel Martinez was truly, completely, joyfully free to be herself. Outside her apartment, the world continued its complicated dance of relationships and boundaries, love and control, family dynamics, and individual autonomy. Inside, Isabel continued the beautiful work of living a life that belonged entirely to herself, protected by law, sustained by authentic relationships, and guided by the kind of self-respect that had transformed her from a people-pleaser into a person who knew her own worth and refused to negotiate it away for anyone's comfort. The future stretched ahead of her, vast and uncertain and entirely her own to navigate. And for the first time in her adult life, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than fear. Isabel Martinez was finally home, not in a place, but in herself. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.